Hi guys, this is Mrs. Foy, and this is a tutorial about histology. Histology is the study of tissues, So what exactly? Well, if you remember back in basic biology, we talked about the different types of organizations. This graph is called the level of, or this diagram is called the level of organizations. Level of organization in biology. So we have cells, and we have different cells in the human body, and we know that cells work together to form tissues for a similar function. We know that tissues work together in the same function to form an organ. We know that organs can work together in the same function to form an organ system, and we know that organ systems can work together to form an organism, an advanced organism. So, for example, if we take, there are different types of cells. There are neuron cells, and there are epithelial cells, and there are different types of connective cells. And these form different tissues. So we have muscle tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. These work together to form different organs, and in this picture we're talking about the kidney. And then the kidney works together to form an organ system. Here we have the bladder, the ureters that form with the kidneys to form the urinary system, and then we have our organisms. So we're talking now about this level right here. We're talking about this level right here, the tissue level, and that's what histology is. So one of the things when you study histology, we're mostly looking through a microscope, and one of the things that you have to be able to tell is whether you're looking at a cross section or a longitudinal section. So up here we see that these cells, these are actually muscle cells, actually smooth muscle cells. And what I'm looking at right here in this part of the tissue is when this slice was taken from this tissue to make a slide, these cells right here are actually going in and out of the board. So it would almost be like opening up a carton of straws and seeing the tops of the straws sticking out through the top of the carton. These are longitudinal sections. So I'm looking at the cell kind of from the side, and I'm seeing the whole cell. So here's the nucleus, and then here is the actual cell. So here's the nucleus, and there's the cell. This is more of a cartoon. This is what it looks like under the microscope. So here is a cross section, and my cells are going in and out of the board. So in and out of the board here, like the tops of straws. And then here are my longitudinal sections. So I'm looking at the long cells actually laying sideways. So that's important to know. The other thing is that when you're looking at some slides under the microscope, you need to look for free space. So up here, this is actually right up in here, this is actually the free space that is in this slide. And so I know that the very first tissue that I see that is surrounded by free space or air or whatever is epithelial tissue. And this is one of the tissues that we're going to study today. Epithelial tissue is tissue that lines all free spaces. So down here, this is just the end of the slide. But up here, that's free space. So that's practice, figure that out. So our human skin is actually the example of an organ because there are different types of tissue that are in skin. So here we see adipose tissue. This is actually fat, adipose tissue. We see epithelial tissue here. Epithelial tissue is lining this. We have nervous tissue because our nerves run through our skin, so we have nervous tissue. And so our skin is not a tissue, it's actually an organ. And this is an example of some different cells here. So these are melanocytes, which produce melanin, and melanin is a pigment in our skin that helps us, it prevents ultraviolet radiation damage from the. So muscle tissue is what we're going to study first here. So muscle tissue is basically three different types. We have skeletal muscle, we have smooth muscle, and we have cardiac muscle. It is very important to know in muscle tissue, all muscle tissue is going to allow you to move, or the muscle cell itself is going to contract. That's the only thing that muscles allow you to do, is that they contract. But whether or not you contract voluntarily or involuntary is our next category. So, for example, skeletal muscle is what you think of when you think of like your biceps or your triceps or your quadriceps. These are voluntary. That means that you can, on purpose, move them. You can think about it and you can move them. They're also striated. When you look at them under the microscope, striated is a fancy word that means striped. Kind of looks striped. In contrast, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are what we call involuntary. That means that you cannot control them on purpose. So you can't make your heart speed up or slow down. And you can't contract your uterus if you're a woman on purpose or not. So these are what we call involuntary, and that is an important category with voluntary. So we're going to start with skeletal muscle first. And if you looked at an actual muscle, so here is an actual muscle, you would see that it has these long, thin bundles of cells that we can break down into an individual cell called a muscle fiber. A muscle fiber is the same thing as a muscle cell. And a muscle cell does not look like a circle. It's actually a long, thin cell. And in the case of skeletal muscle, which is also called striated muscle, which remember is voluntary, so it has a lot of different names. It has a couple of characteristics that you can see under the microscope. The first is that it is multinucleated. So all these things here are nuclei. So it is multinucleated. The other thing that you see is that you see a stripe pattern here. Almost looks like a zebra, right? And those stripes are actually different proteins called myosin is the name of one protein, and actin is another protein. And those are very important because they produce a banding pattern that shows up under the microscope that you can easily see, and of course it has to do with how it functions. That's striated muscle. Smooth muscle is, remember, involuntary. We cannot control our smooth muscle. One of the places that we see smooth muscle is lining our intestines, and we actually have two different layers of smooth muscle in our intestine. We have a longitudinal layer which goes up and down like this, and then we have a circular layer which goes like this. And the coordinated movements of the longitudinal muscle layer and the circular muscle layer allows food to move through the colon, and we call this, or the intestine, and we call this peristalsis. That is the movement of food and materials through the intestine. And that is an example of where you would find smooth muscle. So when you look at smooth muscle, one of the things that we see is we don't see that zebra pattern. They do have actin and myosin filaments, but they are not they're not in the same pattern as they are in striated muscle. So we say that these muscle cells are spindled shape. They do have a single nucleus, so they are single nuclei. Section there we're looking at. Cardiac muscle is kind of a mixture. So we know that cardiac muscle is involuntary, right? We know it's involuntary. You can't make your heart beat. It is actually under different kinds of control. But if you look very carefully at the tissue, you will see that it is striated. So we do see striations. We do see this pattern of actin and myosin filaments that are in a regular banding pattern. So we do see some striations. And we do see some nuclei, okay, but these are just one nuclei per cell. And the other thing that we see that's very interesting is we see this thing called intercalated discs. And this is a hallmark of cardiac tissue. So what are intercalated discs? Well, they are special channels between one muscle cell and the next muscle cell. So there is an intercalated disc right there. And what their function is they help the adjacent cardiac muscle cells to communicate better. Because the whole point of muscle contraction in the heart is that it needs to be orchestrated so it's done in unison or done together. And these intercalated discs help that to happen. So when you look at when you look at cardiac muscle under a microscope, you will see some striations, but the one thing that you see that's really a hallmark is you see those Our next type of tissue is called nervous tissue. So this is tissue number 2. Our first one was muscle tissue, and now we're talking about nervous tissue. Nervous tissue's job is communication. So just like muscle tissue's job was to move, was for movement, the nervous tissue is for communication. The two places that you find nervous tissue is you find it in the brain, and you find it in the spinal cord, the brain and the spinal cord, and you also find it in nerves. So nervous tissue is made up of different types of tissues, different types of cells. Nervous tissue is made up of different types of cells. And one type of cell is called a neuron. Neurons are my favorite cells. They're absolutely beautiful. They look kind of like a tree, where here is the trunk, and here are the roots, and then these would be the branches. And so sometimes these long trunks are called axons, and here is an axon right here, and then this would be what we call the cell body. There is the nuclei right here, and these are long branches called the dendrites. And there are other cells in nervous tissue that mostly support the neurons, and we'll talk more about those later. These are for communication, usually electrocommunication. Our next type of tissue, so this is going to be tissue number 3, is connective tissue. And connective tissue is the biggest hodgepodge of tissue. So it's kind of like all the other tissues that didn't fit into a category. Scientists put them in one big category called connective tissue. The one thing that they all have in common is connective tissue has cells in what we call a matrix. A matrix is the background material. So sometimes the matrix can be solid. Sometimes the background material, remember matrix means background material. Sometimes the matrix can be semi-solid, like a gel, and sometimes it's liquid. So for example, one of the things that we see in liquid tissue is the example of blood. So blood is kind of like peas in pea soup. That's how I think of this, peas in pea soup. So the peas are the actual cells. There's red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and then the soup is the liquid matrix that we call plasma. That's the liquid part. An example of a connective tissue that has a solid matrix is bone. So bone has cells in it, but the matrix of bone is solid because of minerals like calcium and phosphorus. And then we have an example of a gel matrix, which would be what we see in cartilage. So if you bend the tip of your nose or you bend your ears, you can tell what cartilage is. It is semi. So our first tissue is blood, a liquid tissue. What are the cells? Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And as we said, the matrix is the liquid called plasma. So that's the watery substance that contains many different important proteins in it. So the red blood cells we see here, these are examples of red blood cells. They look kind of maroon, and they look like they're white in the center, but actually if you looked at a red blood cell sideways, you would see that it is very, very thin in the middle, and there's no nucleus, and so it looks kind of like it has a white shape in the middle, but this is a special name called a biconcave disc. a biconcave disc. And there is hemoglobin. There's a very important protein called hemoglobin that we're going to see in red blood cells. And that hemoglobin protein, can't see it under a microscope because it's too small, but it's in red blood cells and its job is to carry oxygen. White blood cells' jobs is to fight infection. So these bigger cells that you see here in this slide are examples of white blood cells. And of course these are stained, guys. They're not really purple in real life, although red blood cells are red. And then our last type of tissue are platelets. Platelets are little cell fragments that have to do with blood clotting. So there's an example of some platelets that have to do with. All right, bone. Bone is amazing. So you have these different types of cells called osteoclasts and osteoblast. So we've got some terms here. So we have osteo. Everything in bone is called osteo. So we have osteocytes, which means cyte is a fancy name for cell. Osteo means bone. And we have two different types of osteocytes. We have osteoblasts, which build, and osteoclasts, which break down. And so bone is constantly remodeling itself. And that's a tricky business because the matrix is solid. So we have this pattern of bone development that is called an osteon. An osteon looks kind of like this tree trunk here that you see, and it has a canal in the center called the Haversian canal. That's where blood vessels, so you would have an artery and a vein and a nerve that come up through that Haversian canal so it can get through that solid tissue. And then in these little spaces, these are little caves called lacunae, kind of like little caves. And in those little caves are where we see our osteocytes. And that's what bone looks like, very distinctive. Cartilage is the type of connective tissue that we said has a semi-solid matrix. So it's not a solid and it's not liquid, it's somewhere in between. And one type of cartilage that we have that we're going to be looking at in class is called hyaline cartilage. And hyaline cartilage also has these structures called lacunae. And in those little caves are called chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage. So chondrocytes are similar to osteocytes, except these are the cells that make the materials for cartilage. So this is what we need for cartilage. And cartilage's job is to cushion and also helps to lubricate joints. So we usually see cartilage at the end of bones and in joints. Adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is really important, but it is also something that we struggle with in modern society. Adipose tissue's common name is fat, okay? And we're not talking about fat like eating a French fry or oil or something. We're actually talking about body fat. Body fat is what we call adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is very specialized. They are made of these very, very thin cells. This is actually the cell right here. All right, it's a very thin cell that you see here. So it has a nucleus. Here's the nucleus right here. It has its cytoplasm. It's very, very thin. And most of what takes up the space in adipose tissue is this big drop of lipid. Lipid is actually the dietary fat. So this would be a fat like butter or oils are lipids. And this is a storage. Adipose tissue is for storage because we use this type of fuel to be able to run our body. This is a long-term storage of fuel in adipose tissue. So we use adipose tissue for storage, we use it for cushioning, we use it for protection. So for example, when you guys dissect our fetal pig, you're going to see there's a lot of fat around the kidney. And that's one of the things. Areolar tissue is a fancy name for something called loose connective tissue. And we see areolar tissue sometimes underneath our skin in the dermis region, and it's going to be kind of a hodgepodge tissue that we sometimes find in between other types of tissue. And one of the things that is important about areolar tissue is that we see these cells called fibroblasts. So a fibroblast is a cell in areolar tissue, and it makes two different types of fibers. So we have collagen fibers, which are very strong. You can think of those as very strong cables. They are very strong protein cables. Oops, cable, sorry, that's a B. And then our other type of fiber is an elastin fiber. These fibers are thinner and they are elastic, so they're stretchy. So you can imagine what areolar tissue is like. It's got these collagen fibers in it that are for support, but it also has some stretchy, flexible elastin fibers in it. And that is what is important. Another type of tissue is called dense fibrous connective tissue. Sometimes it's called white or dense white fibrous connective tissue. So in this case, what we see is we see these fibroblasts, but now in this tissue, we're just making collagen fibers. And remember, these are like strong cables. The collagen fibers are very, very strong, and they're almost kind of braided together. It almost looks like wavy hair to me, but the collagen fibers are very densely packed, and you got it. This is a very, very strong tissue. And that's the type of tissue that we see in tendons. Tendons are what connect a muscle to a bone. And every place you see a muscle and then you see a bone, you can bet that you're going to see some tendons. And now you know why tendons are so strong. They have very densely packed collagen fibers there. So the difference between a tendon and a ligament is a tendon is what connects muscle to bone, and a ligament is what connects a bone to bone. So we're going to talk more about that later in class. But that's our last type of tissue, tissue number 4. So let's see, we've had muscle tissue, we've had nervous tissue, we have had our connective tissue, and now this is our last type of tissue. This last type of tissue is called epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is the tissue that lines every open space in our body. So it is in our skin, but it also lines openings, like the opening of our mouth, the opening of the vagina, the opening of, for example, your circulatory system, the blood vessels there. Your respiratory system is lined with epithelial tissue. Your digestive system is lined with epithelial tissue. So anything that has an opening to the body is lined. And we have two different major categories of epithelial tissue. We either say it's simple or we say it's stratified. Simple means it's just one layer, and stratified means multi-layers. So we also classify epithelial tissue by the shape of the cell. So a squamous cell is going to be very flat and kind of irregularly shaped. I think of it like a paving stone. A cuboidal shaped cell is just that. It looks like a cube. A columnar cell is taller than it is wide, just like a column. So you can have stratified squamous cells, although these down here certainly look more cuboidal, don't they? And you can have stratified cuboidal. And then you can have something called pseudo-stratified columnar. Pseudo means falsely. And so this means it is tissue that looks stratified, but it's only one layer. So simple squamous epithelial tissue is made up of, it's just what it says, simple one layer, squamous made of the squamous cells. These are very thin and flat cells. So we see these, for example, lining like your alveoli in your lungs. So it's very thin, and it allows material to go back and through easily because it's very thin. Epithelial tissue also has something called a basement membrane, and that's what basement membrane. This is an example of simple columnar tissue. All right, so I can see These are my columnar cells here, right? Tall and thin. There's the nuclei. So I have this one layer of very tall and thin cells, and this is an example of simple columnar. This is an example of simple cuboidal tissue. So this is actually a tube that you see going through here. That's my empty space. ES is empty space. And then here I have my simple cuboidal. This is actually, I think, in the kidney. This is simple cuboidal tissue, and then I have more simple cuboidal tissue right here. Then this would be loose connective tissue around the outside of there. This is one of my favorites. This is called pseudostratified ciliated epithelial tissue. That sounds very scientific, doesn't it? So pseudostratified columnar. So that means that these are these long, tall cells that look like they are more than one layer, but actually the nuclei are just not lined up, and so it's falsely columnar. But then what makes it special, it has this brush border of cilia, and this cilia is going to beat. This is found in the respiratory system, and this cilia beats, and these cilia actually move a layer of mucus, and this is what helps to clean out our air, our lungs. This is an example of skin. This is what skin looks like. It is stratified squamous epithelial. So down here at the basement membrane, this is my empty space or my open space, and I have layers after layers after layers in my epidermis, or my skin, of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And I think that's it. That's the last slide. Hope this has been helpful. See you in class.